Skeptics in the Pub online. I'm Kat from the Merseyside Skeptics Society, and I'll be your host for the evening. If you're joining us for the first time, Skeptics in the Pub online is a coalition of various Skeptics in the Pub groups from across the UK and Europe. We came together when the COVID pandemic meant that we couldn't have our monthly meetings in pubs, so now we have weekly talks online on a variety of topics that promote science, reason, and critical thinking. For more information about future events, please find us on Facebook or Twitter, or check out our website. That's SitP.online. The format for tonight is we will have our talk from our excellent guest speaker, then we will take a short break followed by a question and answer session. If you would like to join in with the Q&A, please go to sitp.online/ask to submit your questions or to upvote questions that you would like to see asked. Our lovely moderators will be dropping that link into the chat bar, along with other useful links throughout the night, including links to our Discord channel, where you can chat to other skeptics, and our YouTube channel, where you can catch up on previous talks. We'll hopefully have live closed captions available throughout tonight's event as well. After the Q&A, we will be opening our virtual pub, the Lock-in's Razor, where you're more than welcome to join us for a chat and a drink of your choice. Tonight, we are joined by Professor Alex Vitale. Alex is Professor of Sociology and Coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has spent the past 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organisations internationally. He is author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and of The End of Policing. The electronic version of The End of Policing is currently available to download for free on Verso Books. So please welcome to the screen and fill the chat with applause, Professor Alex Vitale.
Thank you, Kat. It's very nice to be with you all this evening virtually. I'm only sorry we can't be in the pub together in person, which would definitely be my preference. I'm not an expert on British policing. I have worked with British police. I have been on ride-alongs. I have spoken at gatherings of British police leaders and generally followed developments there. But the book, The End of Policing, is about American policing. And I'm sure we'll talk more in the Q&A about the applicability of these ideas to the specific British context. But I will mostly talk this evening about how I understand these questions in relationship to American policing. But I think some of the overlapping similarities will become clear as the conversation progresses. So, in the period about 6 years ago, following the police killings of Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and so many others, we were told here in the States that, don't worry, we're going to fix policing. We're going to institute a whole set of reforms, accountability and oversight mechanisms, and this will convince everyone that policing has been fixed so that we can have our trust in police restored so that police can get back to doing what police do. President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing that issued a multi-page report filled with a huge number of recommendations for how to fix policing. And many cities, though not all, across the U.S. have implemented some or quite a few of these interventions. One of the cities that took this approach the most seriously was, in fact, Minneapolis. They even wrote a glossy report outlining all of the Obama reforms that they had implemented. And the fact is that the officers who were involved in the killing of George Floyd had had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a new use of force policy that emphasized sanctity of life, were operating under a new policy that required that officers intervene when they see misconduct by a fellow officer. They were operating under a new early warning system designed to identify potentially problematic officers so that they could be retrained or let go. And none of it made any difference. George Floyd's life just didn't matter to them. And what we've seen across the United States is no change in the overall pattern of killings by police, and no real change in the level of police enforcement activity, complaints against the police, etc. Policing in the US has not been reformed. And how could it be? The central idea behind most police reform initiatives, many of which are in use in the UK, things like implicit bias training that I'll talk about in a minute, rest on a framework of what we call procedural justice. Procedural justice is based on research that shows that when people within the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, take the time to explain what they're doing, follow proper procedure, give people a chance to tell their side of the story, that people feel better about the outcome. Even if they end up getting a ticket or getting arrested or having to pay a fine, they feel better because they feel that some due process has been enacted. And this is then applied to policing to produce a whole set of reforms designed to get police to follow proper procedure, either through training, changes to rules, or tightening up of oversight and accountability mechanisms. But this rests on the assumption that the harms that policing produces in society are limited to those things that are improper, are a violation of policy, are the result of individual officer bias, inadequate training. And mostly this revolves around the very high-profile, horrible incidents that have driven much of the media conversation about policing, the Eric Garners and the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors. And this leads us to try to reverse engineer these kinds of procedural changes to policing without actually interrogating deeper questions about the nature and function of policing in our society at this particular moment and historically. And this leads to things like implicit bias training. So implicit bias training is based on research that shows that in a laboratory setting, when we put people in front of monitors and we show them different images and different scenarios and we give people little buttons to push in reaction to events, that people express these very slight preferences for lighter skinned faces over darker skinned faces that are, measured in little milliseconds of differential pushing of buttons. And this research is fairly consistent in the aggregate in showing these slight differences in outcome. But it turns out that this research is not able to show consistent results at the level of individuals. It's also not able to show a connection between how you score on the test and your actual behavior in the real world. Now, this is not to say that people don't have implicit bias. It's merely to say that it's complex and its effect on actual decision-making and behavior is much cloudier than the proponents of this idea would normally have us believe. But there's a bigger problem, right? It imagines that we can fix the problems of racially disparate outcomes in policing through a 3-hour training module that talks about, the history of slavery and the role of police in reproducing inequality. And there's absolutely no research that shows that that kind of intervention is effective. And how could it be? First of all, in the US, we have a problem of explicit racism. when we look for it, we find it in the Facebook pages, the policing chat boards. Sometimes the official statements of our police union leaders contain explicit racism. We know that white supremacist groups are active within our police departments. And so to imagine that we're going to fix that problem with a few hours of lectures on racial sensitivity seems incredibly naive. But we have a bigger problem. We have a problem of structural racism. It doesn't really make sense to say that all the problems of racially disparate policing in the U.S. can be reduced to intentional racism by specific officers. The whole institution of policing from its inception, especially in the United States, has been rooted in a mission of producing racial difference. I argue that the first police force in the world that meets the modern definition of a professional modern police force is the Charleston City Watch and Guard, created in the late 1700s. They were uniformed, civilian, professional, 24-hour law enforcement oriented. But the primary legal system that they were enforcing was the laws of slavery. In Charleston and the other big cities of the American South, slaves actually worked outside the homes of their owners, on wharves and warehouses and workshops, and their wages were returned to their owners. But this meant there was a large population of slaves who had to move around between home and work and while working. And in fact, in many of these cities, that population of slaves outnumbered the local white populations. And this, not surprisingly, gave rise to fears of revolts, uprisings, runaway slaves, crime, violence, disorder, etc. And the Charleston City Watch and Guard is formalized into a full police department primarily to manage that mobile slave population in a way that was procedurally proper, lawful, and in a sense unbiased, because the laws of slavery applied equally to all Black people. Policing has continued to serve this function even after slavery, driving people into convict leasing, driving people into plantation prisons, policing the color line of the North, the ghettoization of cities, preventing the free movement of Blacks in our society. And even our current war on drugs should be understood as a racial project enforced by policing. And this leads to an even bigger problem, which is not just the institution of policing rooted in this racist history, but the decision-making of elected officials to turn the problems of primarily Black and brown communities into problems of crime to be managed by policing. That's a decision that's been made. These elected officials have imagined that the problems that Black and brown communities face are the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions of policing and mass incarceration. And so problems of drug addiction, drug dealing, overdoses, mental health crises, mass homelessness, black market activities become defined as crime problems to be suppressed by policing, failed schools, youth violence, etc. This means that those communities face additional burdens. Now, police will say, you can't say that the racial disparities of policing are about individual bias because we just go where the calls are. And there is some truth to this, though not entirely. But that truth is rooted in this conversation about what counts as crime. Here in the US, we have political officials who've gone along with the poisoning of entire municipal water supplies for political convenience. But that's not defined as a policing problem, even though it's causing tremendous harm. We have banks who've engaged in predatory lending practices, mortgage fraud, and this is considered a regulatory issue or just aggressive business practices. Certainly not something that's measured as crime for police to manage. This is the problem with things like community policing. Community policing says for the community to bring all its problems to the police for the police to solve. And this sounds on the surface like a positive intervention. Don't we want the police to be connected to the community, to be involved in problem solving, to work constructively with communities? Well, the first problem is the research shows that this is not really how community policing works. The police are actively involved in producing who they consider to be legitimate interlocutors for the community. If you go to one of these police community meetings, they're not very representative of the communities that they take place in. They tended to be dominated by older stakeholders in the community, landlords, small business owners, leaders of conservative residential associations. They're rarely young people, homeless folks, immigrants, folks who've had problems with the criminal legal system. And when people do raise difficult questions about inappropriate policing, they're very clearly pushed out of these processes. But the bigger problem really is the decision to use police as the primary mechanism for solving community problems. What tools do police have ultimately to solve community problems? Guns, handcuffs, ticket books, tasers, tear gas. They don't have access to high-quality, affordable housing. They don't have access to community-based mental health services. They don't have access to medically-based drug treatment services. They don't have access to counselors for kids in schools. They don't have access to therapeutic anti-trauma interventions for young people who are experiencing violence in their lives. Police don't actually have the tools that would be needed to create healthy, safe communities. At root, police are violence workers. That's what distinguishes them from other government actors, is the authority and capacity to use force. Even if it's unarmed force, as is more common in the UK, there was just recently a case of someone who was repeatedly tasered and then kicked in the head and died in police custody. So this isn't all about guns, but it is about violence. The root of police authority is not just some abstract laws that they enforce. It is that capacity and authorization to use violence. When a police officer gives you an order, it is backed up by that ability to use force. Now, we hear often that, well, policing is really about enforcing the law, policing by consent. People want there to be a rule of law. The rule of law benefits everyone equally. And that's what leads a lot of elected officials to fall into this trap of procedural justice, of thinking that if we just tighten up the rules and the processes, that this will fix the problem. But this is a misunderstanding of both the nature of policing and the nature of the legal systems in which police operate. First of all, I think we should understand policing not primarily as a tool for enforcing the law. It's an institution for producing order. And that order doesn't benefit everyone equally. And neither do the legal systems that they do sometimes enforce. I mean, the reality is that most of what police do is not directly tied to anything in the statute books or even common law. It's about managing all kinds of low-level disorders. low-level disputes that haven't reached the level of criminal behavior, that aren't spoken to directly in the law books. But the legal systems as well are problematic. There's a famous 19th century saying, "The law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets." But of course, the rich don't need to do these things. Only the very poor do. And that legal system reproduces inequality by its very nature. And I think a more stark example of this, and a more contemporary in a sense, although we do have the mass criminalization of poverty and homelessness in the US, is our war on drugs. The modern war on drugs, created in the late 60s and early 70s, was a political project, not a public health intervention. The Nixon administration was looking for a way to criminalize its political enemies and also to appeal to formerly democratic white Southern and suburban voters. In the American South, before the end of segregation, white voters were almost entirely part of the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party had been the party of Lincoln that had prosecuted the Civil War and freed the slaves. And it made for a kind of strange alliance, because the Democratic Party was more of a party of workers. And so it created these odd political alignments. And during the 1960s, when President Johnson signed civil rights legislation that helps bring about the end of formal segregation, many whites were very angry about this. And Republicans decided to try and take advantage of this, not by imagining that they could bring back segregation, but by instead creating the war on crime. Now, our federal government has usually very little to do with law and order, with crime in the conventional sense. This is a matter for states and local police. Nixon's people came up with this idea that they could use drugs as the tool for getting the federal government into the law and order business. They said, look, drugs often cross state and international boundaries, so it's a federal issue. So Nixon creates the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency, begins ramping up penalties for drugs, radically expands law enforcement, all of which to signal to these white voters that the new tool that would be used to manage race and produce racial inequality in the United States would be criminalization through the drug war. How do we know this? Because Nixon's own advisors have come forward over the years and told us they were in the meetings, and that this whole undertaking was about a cynical politics of race and not about public health or public safety. Nixon's own drug policy advisors were in favor of legalization and harm reduction strategies, but they were overruled by these political needs. And so the idea that we're going to fix the problems of policing by giving narcotics units anti-bias training is just ludicrous. Instead, we need to end the war on drugs. We need to get government out of the drug business. Now, this is what Portugal has done. Portugal has decriminalized all drugs and turned it over to public health authorities. And this has produced much better outcomes for them. Lower overdose rates, lower HIV and hepatitis C infection rates, lower overall rates of drug use. They're very happy with the outcomes. Voters here in the state of Oregon voted in November to do the same thing, to get the police out of the drug business and to turn the problem over to public health authorities, to create supervised injection facilities, needle exchange programs, to radically expand availability of high-quality drug treatment services, to look at targeted community investment initiatives to help deal with what drives problematic drug use and drug dealing. And I think this is a model we need to look at more broadly. Not to imagine that we can reform narcotics policing, but that we need to replace it with something better. Between a quarter and half of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. It's one of the leading predictors of being killed by police in the US. Police shouldn't be in that business. Over the last 40 years, we've systematically defunded mental health services. We closed down the large problematic state hospitals with a promise that resources would then be shifted into community-based care. But those shifts never happened. Instead, people have been largely left on their own with a bottle of pills and told to manage these things on their own. The result has been a growing number of mental health crises and the radical expansion of a population of homeless people who are unable to maintain their stability without ongoing mental health care and supportive housing. As a result, police have become the backstop. It's not something they chose. It's not something they angled for. It's not something most of them really want to do. But elected officials, by defunding mental health services, have created a huge problem of disorder and sometimes violence that they have defined as something for police to manage. And no matter how hard the police try, no matter how much training they get, the outcomes are not good. Now, this is not to say that every interaction results in some horrible death. Quite the contrary. The vast majority of these interactions are managed according to proper procedure. But the outcomes still aren't good, because what options does the police officer have in a situation like this? They can force someone into an emergency room that they often do not want to go to, where they get temporary care and then are released back into the community with a bottle of pills and at best a follow-up appointment to an oversubscribed clinic. Or they can take the person to jail. They can define their problem as one of illegal criminal behavior and transport them to a local jail. The three largest mental health facilities in the United States are the municipal jails in Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, where up to a third of people who are incarcerated on any given night are there primarily because they have a mental health problem, complicated by problems of homelessness and substance abuse. Or the officer can attempt to just manage the problem in some informal way, hoping that it will be abated for the time being. And what we find is that all of these interventions fail to provide real stability for people and typically result in lots of future calls to the police. Here in New York City, where I'm speaking to you from, the NYPD goes on almost 250,000 of these calls every year. It's become a major part of what police do. And unfortunately, the situation is moving in a similar direction in the UK. Now, the UK had largely avoided this problem by having some base level of mental health services. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps. But it allowed them to have a policy that said that police, if they get involved in these encounters, should be focused on transporting someone to a place of safety where they will have some support and care. But increasingly, those places are becoming unavailable. Outreach teams are less numerous. And this means more of the burden of this is falling on police. And too often, people are ending up in local police lockups where their mental health situations are made worse, not better. How did we get into this mess? Well, I think some of the stories I've told you give you a hint. What we've had over the last 40, 50 years is a situation where politicians at all levels have capitulated to a kind of neoliberal austerity, beginning with the Thatcher government in the UK and the Reagan government in the United States, with origins that predate it. These elected officials have embraced a certain notion of globalization, global competition, that has helped to create profits through the roof for a small number of global economic leaders, and a hollowing out of the economy for everyone else. And their response to this situation, which they helped create through financial deregulation and global free trade agreements, was to create a kind of race to the bottom, where local places feel they have no choice, including national governments, right? No choice but to continue to try to subsidize these already most successful economic actors in hopes that they will become so competitive on the global stage that some of their wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. And so in order to pay for all these subsidies, deregulation, tax breaks, they've had to cut services, cut wages for public sector workers, reduce supports for public housing, public health care. And the result has not been broad prosperity. The result has been the creation of a new billionaire class, which is doing extremely well and is skewing real estate markets, and has produced a huge class of people who've become largely divorced from the formal labor markets and abandoned by social safety nets. And this has resulted in mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass involvement in black market activity of drugs and sex work and stolen goods. And then these problems are defined as problems of crime to be managed, not solved. Police don't solve these problems, they manage them, to be managed by police. And then when the police do things the way police do things, it produces violence and racially disparate outcomes. And then the politicians say, well, don't worry, we'll fix that with some anti-bias training and body cameras. But it's not working. People have seen through that. No one this summer was holding up a protest sign saying more money for police implicit bias training, more money for body cameras. No, they were calling for defunding the police. And what they mean by that is an explicit rejection of this procedural reform narrative that says we can fix policing through rule changes and oversight, and instead saying we need to quit turning problems over to the police. We need to shift resources from policing to specific community-based interventions that these communities think will be better at producing public safety than just relying on police. It's about creating baseline community mental health services, putting counselors back in the schools, creating neighborhood-based anti-violence initiatives, family supports to help reduce domestic violence, high-quality medically based drug treatment services. And if you look at what police actually do day in and day out, they're not chasing bank robbers or finding serial killers hidden behind a bush somewhere. They're chasing homeless people. They're shooing kids off street corners. They're endlessly chasing drug dealers to no good end. And we just don't need police to be doing these things. We need to try to reduce our reliance on policing in as many ways as we possibly can. And as we do that, we evaluate the interventions, we try to make improvements, we assess where we're at, and then we move on from there. There's no magic switch hidden in the basement of some building that allows us to just disappear all police tomorrow. And no one that I know who's doing the actual work of organizing around community safety and working to defund the police believes there's such a switch or even wants to switch it. Instead, we understand there's a massive infrastructure of policing, and we need to begin to chip away at it. And that means instead of more money for more police training and technology, we need to systematically take responsibilities away from police and shift funding into these kinds of specific initiatives. While the UK doesn't face the same explosive, problematic scope of policing we have in the US, it too is being pushed in the same direction. Youth violence, problems in schools, untreated mental health issues, growing numbers of people sleeping rough have all become defined as problems of vulnerable populations that need to be managed by policing. And this is a step in the wrong direction. So I'm going to stop there. I look forward to taking your skeptical questions and having a frank conversation about this difficult topic. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that excellent talk. We're now going to have a 15-minute break so that everyone can refresh their glasses. And during the break, don't forget to submit your questions for Alex by going to sitp.online/ask and upvote questions that you'd like to see asked. So we'll be back here for the Q&A in 15 minutes. And that takes us to about 10 to 8 UK time. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. I hope you're all feeling refreshed and ready for the Q&A. Now, before we get into any of the serious questions, can we see your dog, please?
Here's Buster, who some of you may have heard earlier. Say hi, Buster.
Hello, Buster.
All right. We'll say goodbye to Buster for now.
It's a very sweet-looking dog. Okay, so the first serious question we have in is from David, who asks that, do you accept that the phrase defund the police has been used against BLM and by the right and has done more harm than good?
No. Next question. No. Okay, so, I didn't have any particular allegiance to that 3-word phrase. That was not a phrase that I was using before this summer. But as I mentioned in my talk, it does signal the rejection of police reform and the need to focus concretely on the scope of police power. And that is expressed through funding. Now, many people will say, I support the movement, but I don't support defund the police. And I think there are a couple things going on here. I was actually part of a research talk earlier today in the States with someone who's been doing research about perceptions of the term. And what we find is that a lot of liberals are conflict averse, and so they prefer solutions that don't actually have to involve any conflict, that just seem technocratic. And second, they don't actually agree with the demands of the movement. They think they do because they want to believe that they support racial justice, that they themselves are not racist, but that in fact they don't support the movement. The third thing is that people don't know what it means yet, and we need some time to explain it to them. So to think that we can solve the racially disparate impacts of policing without taking away the scope of their power is to be in conflict with the movement for Black Lives, because that is the core strategic orientation of the movement. And they are sticking with defund the police with the knowledge that people find it upsetting. But so did people who called for the abolition of slavery. So did people who wanted civil rights for African Americans in the 1950s and 60s. We don't choose our movements based on marketing research. We do organizing. We talk to people. We ground this work in an analysis of real justice. And so I accept that the right tries to use this against us, but they will use anything the movement says against it. But I think that when we have the chance to explain to people what it is we're talking about, it turns out that the idea is actually pretty popular and that people do think police do too much.
Okay, so following on from that, a question that or a theme of a question that's come up quite a bit, is that even if you agree that the police aren't the answer to everything and there are systematic problems with it, what is the alternative when there is an emergency, like there's an ongoing robbery or a burglary or an assault happening? What would we have instead of the police?
So part of the problem here, right, and I guess there are two elements to this. One is that we've created this idea that there's exactly one tool to use in every situation, even though that tool is not very well developed for the wide variety of situations that we use it for. The other is that we imagine this false choice between like policing and nothing. So what the movement is focused on is laying out what these alternatives would look like. And it has to be grounded in a conversation about exactly what it is you're talking about, because it turns out the interventions are completely different. So the way we might deal with traffic infractions is very different from how we're going to deal with youth violence or overdoses. So there are a bunch of cities in the US that are now actively involved in getting police out of the traffic business. It turns out that policing is not very effective at managing traffic problems. The research shows that routine traffic stops do not produce better safety outcomes. And it does produce a lot of really fraught encounters that sometimes result in violence and death. So we need to look more at speed cameras, red light cameras, traffic calming infrastructure changes, and creating non-armed, non-arrest empowered civilian teams that can go out and take accident reports, can institute vehicle stops in some cases, and talk to people and maybe write a citation. This is much better than policing. It's cheaper. It's going to be more effective. If we're talking about like residential burglaries, well, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that police never catch anyone in the middle of a burglary. This is a myth of television. We have extensive data that shows that the call never goes into the emergency number until after the crime has already happened. So it doesn't matter how quickly the police respond, it's all over. And then they come and they take a report. And with residential burglaries, most of these reports aren't even investigated, much less solved. Only about 2% of all residential burglaries, at least I know those facts in the US, actually get solved. And even when they do get solved, this doesn't prevent future burglaries. And it turns out that we spend more money incarcerating burglars than the value of all stolen goods that they will ever steal. It just doesn't make much sense. Turns out most residential burglaries are driven by two things: poverty and drugs. So if we want to reduce residential burglaries, let's do something about how we manage problematic drug use, and let's do something about poverty. And this will substantially reduce the problem. Violent encounters, etc. We just had a horrible encounter here in Columbus, Ohio, on the day of the Chauvin verdict. A young woman was being attacked. She called police for help. The police came, saw her struggling with someone, and shot her to death. That didn't protect her. That didn't help her. And in communities of color, this is not an unheard of occurrence, where the person who calls for help in an emergency actually gets victimized by the police. And once again, the police almost always arrive after the violence has already happened. So what can we do instead, right? We need community-based anti-violence initiatives that includes primary prevention, real-time crisis response. Yes, we can send someone other than an armed police officer to intervene in situations. We can also strengthen bonds in our own everyday lives, in our communities, and our families to try to resolve things before they turn into problems of violence. So we have to look at each specific dynamic and talk about what could be done instead. And that's what I try to do in the book for a whole range of things that involve policing now.
I think I've read a little bit of your book. I've not managed to read a lot of it. And I think one of the things that was a really interesting point was a problem with how the police, at least in the US, how they're trained. They're primed to believe that any incident can turn into a lethal incident in a split second. And I've seen some of the footage of the was it Michaela Brandt the other week, who was shot on the day of the Chauvin trial. Yeah. The thing that struck me about that footage is, as soon as that cop gets out of his car, his hand is hovering over his gun. It's like it's just automatically there. He's ready for it to become a lethal incident, and that just seems very strange to me.
Yeah, and I spoke with a former police officer that I talked to sometimes, and she was like, you know, he shot at who he thought was the assailant while that person is standing directly next to the person he thinks is the victim. And one of the things we know about high-stress shooting situations is that the shooting is often inaccurate, that hitting bystanders is quite common. And so he could just as easily have killed the other person, shot both of them. So this is a real problem. But even if we fix this kind of warrior mindset training that says, you know, every encounter could be your last and everything could turn into a deadly thing, you know, this alone is not going to fix the harms of policing. This is not going to dramatically reduce the number of fatalities. You know, we need to look at like, well, why were the police there in the first place? Why were they bothering Eric Garner? Why were they dealing with George Floyd? Why were they responding to Breonna Taylor's house in the first place? And mostly it was to pursue things they just shouldn't be pursuing.
Okay. Our next question comes from Paul, also known as Particulate. And he asks, many of us here in the UK today have voted for a police and crime commissioner. If you're familiar with this, do you think it's a good way to manage policing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was invited actually to the House of Lords to discuss this with some folks, and I doesn't seem to be performing the function that ideally it could, which was to think broadly about public safety, with policing and fire and EMS as just some expressions of an overall plan for producing safe and healthy communities. I think if we did something like that, it would be much better. But basically, they're just playing a somewhat, seems to me, superficial budgetary oversight role and aren't in a position to really create new programmatic interventions to shift resources from policing into community-based services. And so it would be interesting to see it take on that larger role.
Okay. Our next question comes from Anthony, and they ask, in the UK, we reduced stopping and searching for drugs and knives. This resulted in more young Black boys dying by being stabbed. How would you avoid this?
Well, I don't necessarily accept the premise of the question, right? You ask the question in a way that produces its own answer. We don't know that the increase in knife crime is the result of diminishment of stop and frisk activity. Because at the same time, we've seen a big defunding of the community services for these young people. So we could ask the question, is the defunding of community-based social services the reason, isn't that the reason for the drop in crime? And therefore, what should we do about it? Increase policing? So there are a lot of groups across the UK who are working with young people in these areas with high levels of knife crime activity. I'm a big fan of the Forefront Project in London, Kids Kids for Color in Manchester is another great group. And they're actually working with these young people, talking to them about what's driving the violence, the carrying of weapons, the kind of retributive back and forth. One of the things we know is that the young people who commit acts of violence have all been the victims of violence. At the very least, have systematically been exposed to this violence in their everyday lives. They live in a great deal of insecurity, anger, frustration, fear. And adding policing on top of that is not the way to restore them to real, healthy, full participants in society. Even if we could produce some momentary reduction in the knife crime, which we all want, if we do that by Xing people out, by destroying their lives, by furthering their alienation and insecurity, that's a huge cost that has to be factored into that equation. Shouldn't we, in every instance, pursue strategies that don't come with those collateral costs first, push that as far as we can, before we automatically assume more mass criminalization is the way to go?
Okay, great. Our next question is from Andy Wilson. And he says, thank you for this talk. It was very thought-provoking. What has been the effect of decriminalizing marijuana use in the US, please, criminality-wise?
So we don't have like one clear answer to that. We have a growing number of states. Most of them only recently have voted for this. And the states that we've had it a bit longer have used very different models. So, for instance, in Colorado, they've created legal distribution, but not decriminalization. So they're still arresting lots of young people of color for marijuana charges because they're distributing marijuana outside of the legal framework. New York State just passed its law, and it's much better. It both creates a legal outlet and decriminalizes community distribution, allows you to grow a certain amount in your own home, decriminalizes possession across the board, invests some of the revenues in drug treatment and community development. So we have to look at these different models, and we just haven't had long enough to see the effects. The good news is that this is not producing chaos, right? We can look at Portugal. We can see that they were able to decriminalize all drugs, and civilization did not collapse. It was okay. There are still problematic drug users, but it's better than it was, and it doesn't now have all these collateral consequences. So no system is going to be perfect, but I think this is the way to go.
Yeah. Like, I think I remember quite a few years ago, I read about a safe clinic, I think in Glasgow, where people can go and they can get fresh needles. And it's a place where they can take heroin indoors. And back when I read it, the reports were saying that not a single person had died in that clinic because there were medical professionals on hand. And actually, a heroin overdose is reasonably easy to treat if you're fast. I think it's pretty much just an adrenaline shot. So if we're looking at improving safety and improving people's lives, actually putting those kind of facilities in place are really helpful.
Well, see, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to continue to treat things like harmful drug use, involvement in sex work as questions of morality to be enforced by policing in the criminal legal system? Or are we really focused on saving lives, on giving people a chance to turn their lives around? So the problem is, for generations, this has just been a politically motivated moral panic that's based on wagging your finger at people and trying to make their lives miserable so that they will do something differently. It turns out that when you actually stop the moralizing, you make people's lives more stable and secure, that the harmfulness of the drug taking goes down, overdoses go away. You had medically distributed heroin in the UK for part of the first half of the 20th century or middle of the 20th century, and the results were fantastic. No overdoses. People diminished the amount they were using because they knew they were going to be able to get it. There was no mixing foreign stuff into it, so you didn't have those accidental overdoses. And people went back to work. It was a good thing. It's not perfect, but it's much. But the U.S., as part of its drug war, came in and said, we can't allow you to do this anymore. And then in comes the rush of adulterated heroin, problematic heroin use, and overdoses explode. And that's the result of prohibition. It's prohibition that's killing people.
Our next question comes from Eggman, and he asks, with the recent guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin, do you feel that there will be a tangible effect on other police officers' behavior due to the consequences?
No. I mean, I wish that were true. Maybe, the police in the U.S. kill 1,000 people a year, right? So about 3 a day. If there was a conviction of a police officer every day, once a week, then maybe you could argue that this is some watershed change, that police are now going to be really deeply concerned about this. But if it happens once every 3 years in only the most extreme high-profile cases, and then everyone just rallies around and says, that's it, we fixed it. No, this is not going to feed back into better policing.
Mm-hmm. That, when you put it like that, the 3 a day, that's astonishing, really. Our next question comes from Anonymous. They ask, is there enough education of citizens to understand the difficult or impossible role the police have?
I'm trying. No, I don't think so. That's an interesting question. So, I've spent my career working with police, as I mentioned, riding around in police cars, consulting police departments, writing things with police. So for me, it's not personal. It's not about, all cops are bad or something like that. This is a structural question. It's a question of political priorities. And the problem is, though, that the media has portrayed police in this incredibly uncritical light, and also completely unrealistically. So they imagine that police are like superheroes, that they can solve every problem, and also that there is, a super predator behind every bush waiting to jump out at people. You see some of these police shows based in like a particular station house where there's on television, there's a homicide or two every week. But if you actually went to that place, like what was the one that said in Oxford, right? It's like there's a homicide every week in Oxford, but actually they have like one homicide a year in Oxford, and it's usually someone who knew someone. There's not a whodunit. The police come after the fact and take a report, and so it's all incredibly misleading, and there's none of this CSI high tech. We found a paint chip, and then we found this is all nonsense. This is not how this forensic stuff works. So what we need is debunking of these cop shows that skew people's understanding of what policing really is.
I think that really touches on quite a few really interesting points, especially that point of it not being personal. People can go into the police with like the best of intentions and even behave absolutely unquestionably like the way they should, but they're still operating within a system that has been set up in a prejudicial way. So even good cops, it's still questionable outcomes from their behavior.
This is why we can't fix policing by hiring a few more Black minority ethnic officers. I mean, it might make people feel better, but it won't change the substantive outcomes of policing. Right? It's not going to prevent the police from ruining people's lives for no real good reason, even when they follow proper procedure.
Our next question comes from Eagle, and he asks, do you know of any successful attempts at community-based policing or any other types of alternative solutions to the current system in other countries, perhaps?
So there's no one like perfect model out there that we can just say, oh, let's all do it like New Zealand, right? Although New Zealand has some things to teach us, they've shut down all the vice units. They got the police out of the sex work business. They created a regime of legalization, and generally everyone is very happy with the outcomes. Less trafficking, less exploitation, less violence, more labor rights, more options for folks. In Europe, I tell people about school policing in the United States, and they just think we're nuts. They would just never do this. So that's not a question of like community policing or best training practices. It's like, just don't use the police for those things. We have better alternatives. Get them out of the drug business. Get them out of the mental health business. I've written some stuff with police leaders in the UK about the UK's slide into using the police to manage mental health, and they don't want it. They know it's a bad idea, but it's not up to them. It's a political problem. So yes, in the book, the book is filled with examples. There are hundreds of endnotes. Here's how they're doing it here. In Salt Lake City, they've got a great Housing First initiative so that they're not using police to chase homeless people. They're trying to get them into stable housing with support services, community schools models, restorative justice interventions. So we got to look at these menus of things, and then we have to adapt them to different local contexts, because the challenges are not the same for every community. Some places have an opioid overdose problem. Some have youth violence. Some have car break-in. So we gotta address those localized dynamics in keeping with what the real needs are in that moment.
I wonder to what extent that kind of puts people off, like the defunding of the police message. The idea that to some extent it's going to be experimental in part, and there's always that risk, I suppose, that in those experiments things could potentially get worse before they get better.
Of course, if we ask police to provide peer-reviewed research about their effectiveness before they could have any money, we wouldn't have any police either. Right? So we create this double standard, right, where we just assume that policing works and that the more we give them, the more it will work, without any actual evidence to show that. And then we say to any possible alternative intervention, you have to have 16 peer-reviewed studies based on gold standard experimental design before we'll give you $50. Right? That's the dynamic we're in. So if we understand that policing is inherently a risky, problematic business that has very little reason to believe that it is hugely effective. I mean, obviously, if we just eliminated it all tomorrow, we would have problems because we haven't built up this infrastructure, right? But we have evidence already. We know these mental health teams are better. We know community-based anti-violence initiatives can help. We know school policing is a terrible idea. We have the research. What we need is the political will to do something about it.
Our next question comes from Andrew in Peterborough, and he asks, one big difference between the USA and the UK is that we recognised we had a gun problem and dealt with it. What needs to change in the US, and will that ever happen?
Yeah, well, I wish we could just follow your lead, and Australia did a tremendous job, and I think that example is maybe more relevant for the U.S. Part of the problem is that the legacy of violence in the United States is so distributed because, the UK and Europe, they exported their slavery and colonialism. These weren't domestic projects. This was about violence in India and violence in Africa, and violence in the West Indies, and violence in the early American colonies. And it wasn't domestic. In the US, colonialism and slavery were domestic projects. And this directly contributed to the level of violence in the United States. It created these ideologies of violent suppression and violent resistance. It created armed populaces who were out on the frontiers shooting Injuns. That's a real thing, and that legacy still exists. And a lot of this ideology about gun carrying is directly tied to those historical legacies, this fear of the other. But also, our elected officials have been benefiting from framing the social problems that they've created as problems to be managed through personal responsibility backed up by guns. So it's not just that guns are popular. People in Canada have guns. They have hunting guns, and nobody ever shoots anyone because the ideology around guns is completely different. And so there's a lot of political responsibility here. There's a lot of work to do to overcome these legacies. And I think we need to work more on demand side strategies around guns to get people to quit picking them up rather than imagining that we're going to just be able to control access.
Okay, that's really interesting. The idea of coming at it from demand side, that's something I've not heard before. Our next question comes again from Eagle, and he asks, do you think the situation with the police is the inevitable result of the system or just the result of the systematic mismanagement and underlying racism?
Well, the way I think about this is that we should understand policing as a tool that the state relies on to produce order, but that order is rooted in regimes of exploitation. So if we look at the origin of policing in the late 18th and early 19th century, we see that it's tied to the three primary systems of economic exploitation of that era, which are colonialism, slavery, and the rise of industrialization and the formation of a stable industrial working class. And these things often go together. So like the London Metropolitan Police took models from the English occupation of Ireland, which is what Sir Robert Peel was doing before he creates the Metropolitan Police, and then applies it to London to manage the influx of rural agricultural workers displaced by the enclosures movement and forms them into a stable working class. So when we understand these origins, right, then it helps us to avoid making this mistake that we can just fix it all with some superficial reforms.
Okay. Our next question is another anonymous one. And they ask, is the loading of almost every social problem onto US police a problem of ideology on the role of the state? And anything else is socialism and evil?
Well, right. So I think I didn't quite finish that last question, right? Which is just, so maybe I'll just combine these together, right? So the ideological production of policing as the solution to all our problems is a way of masking these systems of exploitation. It's a way of redefining them. So when we define homelessness as a crime problem through things like the broken windows theory, right? It's a way of saying the problem is that these people, in quote, right, these people are morally deficient. They're enacting improper behavior that negatively affects the rest of us. And the way we resolve that is through micromanaging their public behaviors through intensive and invasive policing and mass criminalization. The alternative would be to say that this is the result of market failures. Failures of labor markets, failures of housing markets, failures of social support systems. But the folks who are driving austerity, who benefit from neoliberal redistribution of wealth up the economic ladder, they don't want these problems defined as market failures because they're running the markets. They're benefiting from these arrangements. So they're very happy to have these problems talked about in moralistic terms that will only respond to punitive interventions. And so it is an ideological battle. And so, yes, we have to talk about things like democratic socialism and really rethinking the role of the state in managing these markets.
Okay. Our next question comes from Garnet, and they ask, you talk of the police having to handle a large proportion of mental health issues. How aware of this are the American population in general? Is it hidden?
I think it's becoming more clear because of these relatively small numbers of horrible outcomes. And so what we see is a growing number of cities that are at least beginning to implement non-police crisis response teams. In Austin, Texas, in Denver, Colorado, in Portland, Oregon, in Los Angeles, even here in New York, we have a pilot program now. And so I think that in a way, we've won that argument. Everyone now accepts the idea that police shouldn't be doing this. The problem is getting them to invest in the community-based mental health services so that people don't have a crisis in the first place. That's the real solution to this, and that's going to require a still bigger lift, I think.
Yeah. Our next question comes from As an Android. How recent is the principle that not all police in the US carry guns, e.g., police films in the 1970s, not just the Keystone Cops, don't carry them?
Well, I think by the 1970s, almost all police in the U.S. are armed. And even some of the Keystone Cop era police are armed. They use their billy clubs more. But it's true, the very early police were not all armed. They use billy clubs and their fists and blackjacks and other forms of violence. I think that it's going to be very hard to argue that we should disarm uniformed police officers. My approach is different, which is that we just need to replace them functionally. So instead of trying to disarm school police, let's quit using school police and bring back counselors and teachers' aides and restorative justice supervisors and things like that, who we don't, even on like traffic enforcement. Let's get civilians to do a lot of that, because once people realize that the person pulling them over is not armed, there's no real reason to shoot them. And that's why a lot of British police don't have to worry about being shot. It's not that there are no guns. There are guns. But why would you shoot an unarmed police officer? There's very little reason to do that. You could just get away, which in most circumstances is not going to be the end of the world.
I think you've mentioned school police a couple of times. I think I'm not entirely sure what their role is. I kind of assumed they were almost like security guards in the schools, but I gather that's not.
So we have a mix. We have a mix. We've seen the growth in fully armed, fully professional police officers stationed in schools. Sheriff's deputies, local. So in Oakland, California, like a lot of cities, the school has a contract with the local police department, and they provide armed police. And they protect the students from outsiders, but they're also called upon to break up fights, to enforce disciplinary codes and to make arrests. And they also funnel intelligence to regular police. So we find that they're helping to populate gang databases and identify students for criminalization outside of school. In some cases, there's a lower tier where they're staffing metal detectors and patrolling hallways, and they may not carry guns, but they're still deputized as police, have arrest powers, use force against students, and drive them into the criminal legal system.
Yeah, that just initially that doesn't sound particularly good. Just because if I just think about my time in high school, the amount of kids that like a fight will break out, and if you allow that to just be sorted within the school, that's just two kids being kids. But I guess if there's a police officer on site, that's not just a fight, that's now potentially an assault. And it's just increasing the likelihood of quite young people having a criminal record before they've even really started in life. That sounds really problematic.
It is, and we've just got a ton of research that shows that kids are not made any safer by this.
Yeah. Our next question is another anonymous one. And they've asked, has the funding differential between, for example, mental health services and police been quantified? And did we replace quite cheap services with a very expensive safety net?
So it's complicated because this is happening in different places. So we don't have a national system. Each state had its own state mental health hospitals and other facilities that were then defunded, and then the burden fell on local communities to try to manage the consequences. So, and we don't want to reproduce those state hospitals, which had their own problems. And also, we've developed all these new medications, which with support can help a lot of people live independently, but not without support, especially if they're living in high poverty conditions. So, can we fully fix the mental health problem by just reducing the police budget? Not necessarily. We could make a lot of important advances by doing that, but it may be that there will be additional investments that are needed. And that's even more true of something like homelessness. But we need to start. One of the things cities are doing is little studies. They're saying, well, look, who are the 10, 50, 100, 200 people who we have the most frequent interaction with. And let's figure out how much we're spending on them. Police time, jail time, emergency room time, homeless shelter time. And it turns out for some of these people, it's tens of thousands of dollars, if not $100,000 a year to chase them endlessly through these different institutions. And for a tiny fraction of that, we could just put them in supportive housing.
Okay. I think I'm just
going to give you one more example of this, that in Chicago, they had a population of people who were essentially homeless, mentally ill, living in their emergency rooms. And they were using security to try to kick them out all the time, and the ambulance would keep bringing them out. They finally realized that if they just identified who these people were and housed them, it would be cheaper for the hospital system. So that's what they did.
And I assume that worked out much better.
Yeah.
Okay. We're now going to move on to our final question, which comes from Andrew. And he asks, how do you sell this idea to the wider public? Campaigning politicians like numbers, such as however many more thousand police officers, but increasing mental health funds doesn't seem to get you elected.
Well, I think that's now an open question. We're going to have our city council elections here in New York in June. And what we're seeing is a huge number of candidates running on exactly this platform of producing public safety through mechanisms other than policing. So we'll see, but we are seeing a growing number of candidates getting elected on this platform. And so the advances that we're experiencing in cities like Austin and Portland and Minneapolis is because we're electing new people to office who are like, this is what I want to do. This is, I can't control the whole budget, but I'm at least going to get this pilot program of actually housing some people or creating some mental health services. And I want to do that out of the police budget. And that's starting to happen.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that talk and for that Q&A. And thank you very much for introducing us to Buster as well. It's been great having you with us. And I'd like to say thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. And don't forget that next week we will be joined by Professor Manjeet Dosha, talking to us about Project Stella, from Higgs to healthcare in challenging environments. And I'm sure it's going to be another excellent talk. And that's it for another week. And I'd like to thank tonight's behind the scenes team, which was Laurie and Malcolm on tech and Brian as backup MC, who helped me sort through the questions. We will now be opening the doors to our virtual pub, the Lock-In's Razor, and everyone is welcome. There's no need to turn on your camera or announce yourself if you don't feel comfortable doing so. And there should be links to the call in the chat. But if you can't see the link there, it will also be available on our website, sitp.online. Thanks again and see you soon. Bye.